Hi everyone, and welcome to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Hannah. We are halfway through April, and these past 2 weeks for me feel more like a month. I don't know, April just feels super long for some reason. And I think part of the reason is because it feels like I read a lot more books than usual, but I have graphic novels and a manga in this list, so that definitely helps it go quicker. I was also reading more shorter stories because I have another video I'm working on where two of the books that I read I won't be discussing in this video since those will be in the other. So overall I read 7 books this first half of April, but like I said, I'm not going to be talking about 2 of them, so we'll only be discussing 5 today. The 2 that I'm saving for another time are First Test and Page by Tamora Pierce, so just based on that, you can probably have a good idea of what the video is going to be, so stay tuned for that. The first book I read in April, I had to return to the library, so unfortunately I don't have it with me anymore, but that is Scythe by Neil Shusterman. It is a YA fantasy / dystopia kind of story. It was published in 2016, and I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5. This book is the first in a trilogy, and I have kind of decided for now that I'm probably not going to continue it, but this book takes place in the far, far future where they're not even numbering the years anymore. They're like named after animals, like Year of the Capybara and stuff like that. Humanity has absolutely everything it could possibly desire, and death no longer occurs naturally. So to keep the population in check, they developed this group of people called Scythes, which is a weird word to say with braces. And they select people for what they call gleaning, which is a better way to say death. This story is told from the points of view of 2 apprentice Scythes who quickly learn that this system isn't exactly what they grew up believing it is. This was a bit of an odd book for me because usually I have pretty strong feelings toward what I'm reading, but in this case I felt pretty neutral throughout most of it. Not much actually happens in a majority of the book, and it's a bit of a longer one, so it just kind of felt like it was meandering along, and then the last 100 pages, it just kind of takes off at 100 miles an hour and just doesn't stop. This is one of the few books where I was actually okay with the ending, and I would even be okay with it being a standalone just based on how it did finish. But yeah, since I just feel so neutral on this book, I don't have much to say about it. I enjoyed the experience of reading it, but it wasn't anything that blew me away, and it wasn't anything that really felt new, even though the concept seems really neat. Next is another book that I don't have physically with me anymore, and that is Frankenstein by Junji Ito. So this is a horror graphic novel, and for the life of me, I could not figure out when this was published because some of the stories in the book, it's not just Frankenstein. The first half is Frankenstein, and then the rest is a short story collection. And some of those short stories were originally posted in like a paper or a magazine in like 1999 or some year earlier than that. And then on Goodreads, it had something in like the 2000s. And then there wasn't a publication date in the book itself, I think it was. I remember there was something really strange, and so I couldn't even really figure out when this actually came out. But this book actually bamboozled me a bit. I did not know that there was also a short story collection in it. I thought the entire thing was going to be a retelling of Frankenstein. However, it's actually really faithful to Mary Shelley's story, and so it wasn't really interesting to me because it's a story that I've personally heard a million times, and I'm sure a majority of the world has heard a million times, so it didn't add anything fresh or new to the story to make me see it in a different way, and it was just meh. However, the short stories in the second half of this graphic novel were amazing. Oh my god, 5 out of 5 across the board. They all connected with each other, and they all kind of had something to do with the same character named Oshikiri, who's a high school student, I believe. And at first I was just kind of like, what is going on? Like, this character seems to be in all these stories, but it doesn't really make sense. But then when there's some reveals and it all clicks, it's just like, yes, I loved the reveal, and I can't say too much without spoiling things, but honestly, I would pick this book up just for those short stories. The Frankenstein part, I would give 1 out of 5. I wasn't interested in it. The design of the monster was okay, and he was creepy, but everything else was just kind of like a stereotypical anime-ish style, which for Junji Ito is just kind of eh. So I wasn't interested in that as much as I wanted to be. So on one hand, I have the 1 out of 5, and on the other hand, I have a 5 out of 5. So overall, I ended up rating this a 3 out of 5. This next story is the last book where I don't have it in my possession any longer, and that is The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon, I believe. This is a horror / mystery book. It was published in 2014, and I ended up rating this a 4 out of 5. So this book gives off strong Pet Sematary vibes, which I 100% believe contributes to my enjoyment of it, as Pet Sematary is one of my favorite books I've ever read. So this is told to 3 perspectives and 2 timelines, which I actually think this book did well. In the early 1900s, a woman named Sarah loses her daughter, Gertie. She ends up consumed by her grief, and to try to bring Gertie back, she performs this ritual that she had learned as a child. However, there are unintended consequences of doing that, and they continue to affect the town into modern day. So I ended up being really enthralled with this story. It really intrigued me. I really wanted to know what was going to happen next, and it did end up being predictable in the end, but that didn't bother me as much as it usually does. And I would have to say this is one of the better thriller type books that I have read. And this usually doesn't happen with multiple perspective and multiple timeline books for me, but I was equally invested in all of the stories. So that's why I believe it was done well and wasn't a hindrance to the overall book. One thing I really disliked though is that there was a character that's introduced later in the story that just kind of seemed to be there to add tension and serve no other purpose. And so they were a real like throwaway type of character, and that just didn't really seem necessary. It was just kind of meh. And I think that's why I ended up rating it like a 4 instead of a 5 as part of the reason in the end. Next is the one manga I've read in April so far, and that is The Way of the Househusband Volume 3. This is a comedy manga, and it came out in 2019, and I ended up rating this volume 4.5 out of 5. So this is by far my favorite volume that I've read so far in this series. It includes chapters 19 through 27, as well as 3 bonus chapters. Tatsu's wife, Miku, is featured a lot more, and it kind of shows more of the relationship with each other. It felt more lighthearted, it was less jarring between the chapters, and overall it didn't feel as if his reactions were from like PTSD and stuff like that. It was just more quirky and fun, and just a great little break between books. So because of how much I loved Junji Ito's original stories in the Frankenstein book, I ended up picking up Smashed, which is also by him and is a short story collection of 13, I believe. Yeah, 13 short stories in here. Now, this is also a horror graphic novel, and this one, it actually says was published in 2013. However, I ended up rating this a 2 out of 5, and I even think that might be a bit generous, and I think that's just kind of, I think I just gave a star for the art, cause this is nothing like the short stories at the end of Frankenstein. The best short story out of here, in my opinion, is The Mystery of the Haunted House, and even that for me was just meh to okay. Ito can really draw some creepy and terrifying stuff. Like, I don't even think I'm gonna flip to it in the book. It's really disturbing, it gets in your head, and it's just like, how can you draw something like that? And it's intriguing to me. But the stories around those drawings were just not interesting. They weren't intriguing. The stories weren't scary, and it just left me a bit bored which after loving the other ones so much, this really ended up being a disappointment for me. However, I still want to read more of his works. Like, I know Uzumaki is supposed to be like a masterpiece. I don't know, I guess I just want to try and understand why I feel so differently about these horror collections. And finally, we have a book that is going to be really difficult to describe, and that is Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. Yes. This is a horror novel. I mean, as you can obviously tell by the cover, was published in 2018, and I rated a 4 out of 5. So some of the reviews of this are actually really interesting because people just completely judged it by the cover. They saw this fuzzy, fluffy hedgehog and went, oh, this is going to be a cutesy story and it's going to be just fun and lighthearted. Yeah, no, that's... If you want that, don't read this book. So, trying to describe this book without spoilers or anything is just a bit difficult. But essentially, this is about a girl named Natsuki. She is emotionally, mentally, and eventually physically abused by her family. Like, her mom especially is just trash. She also ends up being sexually abused by a teacher, so content warning for that. There is a lot of abuse in here. There is incest. There is a lot of issues in this book. So do not read if you are sensitive to any of that. But yeah, she ends up confiding to her mother about what happened with her teacher, and her mother does not believe her. Due to incidents like this and how she just feels like such an outsider, she believes that she is an alien, and she is encouraged in this thinking by her cousin Yu, who believes the same about himself. There's an incident between the two of them that completely tears their family apart, and she ends up being haunted by this past into her adulthood. So unfortunately, in the beginning of this book, I could really relate to Natsuki and some of the situations she was in, and I think that's what really drew me into this story, is that I felt like I needed to know what happened to her in the end and how her life turned out. I did really like the commentary on societal expectations in this book. The main example they use is how couples are essentially baby factories and how everyone is expected to have children, and that really hit home for me because I am most likely not going to have children. However, the last 50 pages, even the last 15 pages of this really just go completely bonkers, and I read the last page and a half 3 or 4 times and I still don't really understand what happened. I just don't know. It's odd. I don't understand it. I don't think I will ever understand it. I don't know if we're supposed to understand it, really. But this is definitely a book that stays in your head. So I would really recommend this if you're looking for a read that just completely messes with your head and just makes you wonder what the hell is going on. And this book isn't graphic for the sake of being graphic or anything like that at all. But I really enjoyed reading this. I don't even know if that's the right word to say for that. I was obsessed with this and needed to finish it, and I just couldn't put this down at all. So I really sympathize with Natsuki, although I have no idea what is happening in the end here. My head just hurts thinking about it, really. And that is mostly everything that I have read so far. I'm starting a book this evening that is over 700 pages, so I might not have as many books in my wrap-up for the month, but I'm glad I've gotten through what I have so far. But as always, thank you for hanging out with me today. It is always appreciated. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, as that does help me out a lot. And until next time, bonne journée and au revoir.